President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I asked consent to set aside the pending amendments so that I can call up Senate Amendment 207 and ask for its immediate consideration.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
The senator from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, proposes an amendment number 207.
Mr. President, this amendment is identical to the Social Security Protection Act that I introduced yesterday with Senators Mikulski, Boxer, Sherrod Brown, Blumenthal, Stabenow, Akaka, Whitehouse, Begich, and Lautenberg. This legislation has the strong support of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, the American Federation of Government Employees, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, the Military Order of the Purple Heart, and the Jewish Veterans of America, among others. Mr. President, Social Security is the most successful and reliable federal program in our nation's history. For 75 years, through good times and bad, when the economy was strong and when the economy was weak, Social Security has paid out every nickel owed to every eligible American. And while we take that for granted, that in fact is an extraordinary accomplishment, and it is all done at very modest administrative costs. Social Security has been enormously successful in accomplishing exactly what its founders hoped to accomplish. Before President Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law in August of 1935, approximately half of our senior citizens lived in poverty. Before Social Security, about half of our seniors lived in poverty. Today, fewer than 10% of seniors live in poverty. That number is too great, but it is a significant improvement over what occurred before the establishment of Social Security. Mr. President, what we should be very clear about is that given the volatility of today's economy, there is a great deal of anxiety among the American people about whether or not they are going to be able to retire with dignity. At a time when millions of Americans have seen the value of their private retirement plans plummet, at a time when major corporations have significantly cut back on the defined benefit pension plan and 401k contributions, it makes no sense to me that anybody in this chamber would contemplate dismantling the one retirement program that has been there for 75 years and has worked for 75 years. Mr. President, there was an interesting article in USA Today yesterday, and this is just a couple of the facts that they threw out in yesterday's USA Today. And this is what they say. The percentage of workers who are not at all confident about saving enough money for a comfortable retirement reached 27% in 2011, compared with 22% just last year. Significant increase in a one-year period. When combined with those who said they are not too confident, the total reaches 50% of workers. So we're in a situation, according to USA Today, where almost 50% of American workers lack confidence about whether or not they're going to have enough money to retire with dignity. There's another point that the article made. This is what they say, and I quote, "Quite a few workers virtually have no savings or investments. In 2011, 29% said they have less than $1,000. Well, you're not going to go too far in your retirement with less than $1,000. 56% said that their savings and investments, excluding their home value, totals less than $25,000. Bottom line is that for a variety of reasons, A, the Wall Street collapse of a few years ago, the fact that wages for millions of workers have not kept up with inflation, a significant part of our older workforce today is extremely worried about what happens to them when they retire. And within that context, that there are people in the Congress who would want to start dismantling the one program that has, without fail, been there for 75 years makes no sense to me at all. Mr. President, let me also make another point, and I think it's important to make this point 24 hours a day because we hear so much misinformation coming to us from pundits and from the media and from members of Congress. So let me be very clear. This country has a very serious national debt problem and a very serious deficit problem. We just heard about that. $1.6 trillion deficit. That is serious business, and in my view, Congress has got to be aggressive to address that issue. But here is the point. Social Security has not contributed one nickel to the federal deficit or the national debt. Not one penny. So when you hear people saying, oh, we have a serious deficit problem, therefore we've got to cut benefits in Social Security or raise the retirement age, what they're saying makes no sense at all. These are two very separate issues. In fact, Social Security currently has a $2.6 trillion surplus. Let me repeat that. Social Security has a $2.6 trillion surplus that is projected to grow to $4.2 trillion in 2023. In 1983, when we look back a little bit, it turns out that Social Security did face a crisis. At that point in 1983, if the Congress and then President Reagan did not act, Social Security was projected to run out of necessary funding in 6 months. 6 months. That is a crisis. As a result of the discussions and negotiations and a committee put together by the President, Tip O'Neill, etc., a resolution was reached to that problem, and the Congress overwhelmingly voted for it. Today is not 1983. Today, the Social Security Administration has estimated that Social Security will be able to pay out 100% of promised benefits to every eligible recipient for the next 26 years. Now, Mr. President, this country does face a whole lot of crises. Unemployment is off the wall. Childhood poverty is too high. Serious deficit problem. We've got 2 wars. We're worried about global warming. We got a lot of problems. But it seems to me to be totally absurd that people say, oh, my goodness, we've got to cut Social Security because it can only pay out benefits for the next 26 years. Go to Minnesota and ask a business person and say, if you can pay out all of that you owe for the next 26 years, do you think it's a crisis? People will be shaking their heads. And I should point out that after those 26 years, if nothing is done, and I think something should be done, Social Security will be able to fund about 78% of promised benefits. So, Mr. President, it seems to me that given the enormous importance of Social Security, not only to the elderly, but to people with disabilities, to people who are widows and orphans who have lost the income that a breadwinner had brought into the family, we have got to do everything that we can to protect Social Security. We have got to make it very, very clear that Social Security today is strong, can pay out every benefit for 26 years, has not contributed 1 nickel to the deficit. And that is the amendment that I will be bringing up as soon as I possibly can. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Would the senator yield for a question?
I sure would.
Would the senator explain, and I think that he knows this because he's quite an expert on this program, and I agree 100% with his views that he's just expressed, what is the basic average Social Security income that a person might receive? I understand it's somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000 a year.
I think it's a hair higher than that. I think it's about $14,000 a year. But the point is, I would say to the senator from Louisiana, There are millions of seniors for whom that is either all or almost all of their income. That's it. That's it. And in this day and age, that's the average. So your point is there are people certainly below the average.
And I asked the senator that because it really is striking to me that some members from the other side of the aisle will come and argue that programs like this should be slated for cuts and reductions and yet fail to vote favorably to raise slightly the income tax on families making over $1 million a year in annual income. I frankly, Senator, don't understand that. I'm not sure people listening to this understand it. Could you enlighten us?
Well, here's the story. I agree with you, and I find it hard to understand that there are people who get up here, and we hear the speeches every day, and they say, we have a serious deficit crisis. It is unfair to leave that burden to our kids and our grandchildren. We agree with that. And we say, okay, let's address the deficit crisis, but let's do it in a way that is not on the backs of the sick, the elderly, the children, the most vulnerable people in this country. So what the senator from Louisiana is pointing out, that in the last number of years, what we have seen is that the people on top have been doing very, very well. The top 1% now earns about 23% of all income, which is more than the bottom 50%. The effective tax rate for the very wealthiest people in this country is about 16%, which is the lowest in recent history. And we have given huge amounts of tax breaks in recent years to these very same people. So what I think the senator from Louisiana is saying, and I agree with her, is if we are going to go forward with deficit reduction, which you and I agree we should, let's do it in a way that calls for shared sacrifice. The senator from Louisiana knows that H.R. 1, the Republican House passed bill, would throw over 200,000 kids off of Head Start. Millions of students who are trying to get through college would either get lower Pell Grants or no Pell Grants at all. It is an attack, a devastating attack, a cruel attack against some of the most vulnerable people in this country. They're cutting back on the women, infant, and children nutrition program. You got low-income women now. We're trying to make sure that they don't give birth to low-weight babies. Cut back on that program. But when we say, well, maybe billionaires who are doing phenomenally well might be asked to pay a little bit more in taxes, oh, my word, we have none of that at all. So the issue is shared sacrifice. Don't balance the budget on the backs of the weak and the vulnerable.
I thank the senator from Vermont for that eloquent description and very accurate description of the situation that we're in. I see the senator from Oklahoma that's here for an amendment, and we really want to keep these amendments being discussed, so I thank the senator from Oklahoma for joining us.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
So the chairman knows my planned time to introduce those amendments is 3:30. That's what they've given me a time, and I'll do that. But I did want to engage some of the comments of the senator from Vermont. As somebody who was on the Deficit Commission and looking at that, the first presumption is making Social Security solvent was our goal, making it solvent for 75 years. The flaw in the argument given by my colleague from Vermont is the assumption that the IOU at the Treasury for Social Security is good. It's good as long as people will loan us money. It's not any good if they won't. And so when people say, why fix Social Security? We can fix Social Security by taking the very haircut from the people the senator from Vermont just described and markedly lessening the benefits, even though they continue to pay into Social Security, that they'll receive, the billionaires and the millionaires. We can do that. But if, in fact, we don't send a signal to the international financial community on the largest expenditure we have that we're going to make it solvent, then we won't be in the market and available and have the ability to borrow the $2.8 trillion. Now, one other thing that I would disagree on, the Social Security Trust Fund trustees have said Social Security is running a net deficit last year, will run one this year, and from every year forward in terms of what comes in versus what goes out. There's no question I want to keep our commitments. And nobody's talking about eliminating benefits except to the very rich in this country in terms of Social Security. As a matter of fact, the Deficit Commission raised the benefits in Social Security for the poorest in this country. So we actually did the opposite of what the senator claims that Republicans might want to do. What we have to do is to make sure Social Security is viable for the future. And having looked at every aspect of Social Security, I can tell you if we're not able to borrow the $2.6 trillion, the benefits won't be there. And so although the money has been stolen from, there's no trust fund, there's no money there. If you read what the head of the OMB said in 1999, he said it's not there. So what's really happened in Social Security? Congresses under both Republican and Democrat control, both Republican and Democrat presidencies have stolen money from Social Security and spent it. The money's gone. It's been used for another purpose. So there's two ways of solving that. One is to make Social Security the priority and not fund anything but that till we get it paid back, or actually fund that $2.6 trillion by going to the debt market, which we will go every year from now forward under the present plan of Social Security. The rate of taxes between now and 2035 that will be taxed will rise from $106,000 or $7,000 now to $168,000 between now and then. That is a 60% increase in the taxes on the wealthy that is planned and programmed right now. Even with that, Social Security will run a deficit every year. Every year, now forward. Even with the $2.8 trillion, it still is in a negative cash flow. So to deny the fact, if we don't want to fix Social Security, then what we're saying is we don't want to fix it for our children's children or our children. And I'd like to finish my point. It's not about taking something away except from the very wealthy. The fix from the Deficit Commission. That's what it did. And we also added back is when you reach 80, and a lot of people may be running out of their combination of what their retirement was plus their Social Security, we give another little bump. So what the Deficit Commission did was significantly increase the viability for Social Security for the next 75 years. And there is the Social Security trustees know we have to do this. Everybody knows we have to do this. And the question is does this Congress owe that $2.8 trillion back to the Social? Yeah, but where do we get the money to repay it? And unless we can calm the international financial markets down, where we make major change, not just in Social Security, in discretionary spending, $50 billion out of the Pentagon, modifying Medicare to where we get the fraud, waste, and abuse out of Medicare, unless we do those things, we're not going to be able to borrow the money. One final fact, and then I'll yield back to my chairman because I have a meeting. My colleague, I have a meeting to go. So far, in the last 5 months, who do you think has bought our bonds to finance the deficit? We ran a $223 billion deficit in the month of February. Who bought them? Was it Chinese? Who was the biggest buyer? You know who the biggest buyer was? The Federal Reserve bought 70% of the bonds that we put on the market. What are they doing? They're debasing our currency and creating future inflation, which will hurt the very people who are going to be on Social Security, because the cost of living index will never truly keep up with the real cost of inflation. And all of us have gotten letters from our constituents wondering why there was no COLA. Right? We know why there was no COLA. But when you look at food and transportation costs and what they've done in the last 3 years, that's the thing that's important to seniors. Their health care costs, their housing costs, their food costs. And yet we have a COLA system that says we're not going to recognize that. So if in fact we get into a hyperinflation because the Federal Reserve's buying the bonds because nobody else will buy them, right now 70%, 30% are bought in the market. Final point. the largest bond trader in the world, PIMCO, last week sold every U.S. government bond they have. You know why? They expect the price of the bond to go down because they expect the interest rate to go up. What happens to us if we don't fix Social Security is the interest rates are going to be a lot higher on our debt. And if they're a lot higher and we owe $14 trillion, for every 1% increase in the cost of borrowing that we have, it adds to our deficit $140 billion. So I'm honored that Senator Sanders is adamant about making sure we keep our commitments. But in terms of cash flow, it isn't there. And we have to address that. And the only way we create the confidence is for the international financial community to say, you have a solvent program for 75 years, the largest segment of your expenditures. We get it. We're going to loan you money. If we don't do that, the interest costs are going to be higher, and we're going to pay for it anyway. So right now, we're almost to the point where our decisions are not going to be controlled by us. And I'd rather us be in a situation where they're controlled. This isn't a partisan issue. There isn't one senator that wants to take money away from needy seniors who are on Social Security or somebody coming. This is about making changes far down the road that will affect people 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, and it makes sense to do it. And with that, I yield back to the senator from Vermont.
I thank my friend from Oklahoma. Let me just make a few points, if I might. Are you leaving, Senator? Okay. Then we'll continue the dialogue. But I did want to make a few points. Number one, the senator from Oklahoma gave his understanding about what the Debt Commission would do to Social Security. I do not agree with his characterization of what that commission does. In point of fact, what the Debt Commission does do is cut retirement benefits by more than 35% for young workers entering the workforce today. 35%. Today's 20-year-old workers who retire at age 65 would see their benefits cut by 17% if their wages average $43,000 over their working lives, by 30% if their wages average $69,000 over their working lives, and by 36% if their wages average $107,000 over their working lives, according to the Social Security chief actuary. The proposed cuts would apply to retirees, disabled workers and their families, children who have lost parents, and widows and widowers. So it is not accurate to say that the Debt Commission left unscathed workers. Quite the contrary. Devastating cuts to young workers. But let us answer the question. If the senator from Oklahoma wants to make sure that Social Security is financially solvent for the next 75 years, which I agree with, I want to see that as well, there is an easy way to do it, there is a fair way to do it, and it's a way that doesn't require slashing benefits for younger workers. When Barack Obama ran for president of the United States, he had a pretty good idea. I hope he still has that idea. And what he said is that it is important to understand that right now somebody making $1 million a year pays the same amount of money into the Social Security Trust Fund as somebody who makes $106,000. If you lift that cap, start at $250,000, ask those people to contribute into the Social Security Trust Fund, you will go a very long way to solving the financial solvency of Social Security. I think we should do that. That is certainly not what the Deficit Reduction Commission did do. Let me deal with this issue just very briefly, I say to the senator from Louisiana. We keep hearing that the Social Security Trust Fund just has a pile of worthless IOUs. The fact of the matter is that Social Security invests the surplus money it receives from workers, from the payroll tax, into U.S. government bonds, the same bonds that China or anybody else purchases. And these bonds are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, and in our entire history, and many of us want to make sure this continues, the United States government has never defaulted on its debt obligations. So the point is to say that these are worthless IOUs. It is not dissimilar to say, well, gee whiz, guess what? Because we have a deep deficit and a deep national debt, we don't have any money to fund equipment for our soldiers who are out in the field in Afghanistan or Iraq. That's just worthless IOUs. We can't fund them. That's, of course, nonsense. So do we have to address the deficit crisis? Yes, we do. But my friend from Oklahoma did not respond to the issue of why, if he and his friends are so concerned about our deficit crisis, they vote year after year for hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country. They want to repeal the estate tax, which will provide $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 3/10 of